She was a broke waitress with $347,000 in debt and a dying mother. He was the most dangerous man in the room. He didn't ask for her number. He didn't flirt. He just looked at her, really looked, and said, "You're drowning. Let me change that." One dinner, one impossible choice, and a love story that was never supposed to happen, but changed everything. Here on this channel, we tell stories that live in the shadows, mafia bosses who still know how to love, families who sacrifice everything for each other, and hearts that find each other in the most impossible places. If that's your kind of story, you're exactly where you belong. This story will remind you that being truly seen by another person is worth more than any fortune in the world. If this story moves you, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what you would have done in her place. Share it with someone who believes in love against all odds, and subscribe, because we drop new stories every week that you will not want to miss.
This crazy, dangerous, life-altering moment had been sealed just seconds before he left. I'd called out. I didn't say yes, my voice laced with panic. He had paused at the frosted glass door, turning his head just enough for the light to catch his profile, making him look like some terrible, beautiful devil from a classical painting. But the choice wasn't really a choice. $347,000 meant my mother could be comfortable, pain-free, instead of wasting away in our bug-infested apartment. It meant I might finally sleep for the first time in 3 years. His men had stood with him, a synchronized trio ready to move on his command. He had told me to wear whatever I wanted, that I'd be beautiful no matter what. The whole exchange felt like a fever dream. "You're insane," I had whispered, a hysterical laugh bubbling up that made his security detail shift uneasily. An offer of nearly $350,000 for one dinner? It made no sense. "Why?" I demanded, gripping the table to steady myself. He had studied me for a long, quiet moment with an intensity that felt like it was stripping me bare. His voice, when he finally answered, was softer, which was somehow more unnerving than his authority. "Because," he'd said, a slight curve on his lips that wasn't quite a smile, "you're the first person in 20 years who looked me in the eye without fear or calculation. Only exhaustion. Only humanity." I told him I didn't understand. "You will," he promised. The world had tilted when he revealed he knew everything. Stage 4. The experimental treatment my mother's insurance refused to cover. "Stop," I'd pleaded, the word cracking. "You have no right." But he continued, his gray eyes seeing right through me, noting that I would spend every dime I ever earned trying to save her, because that was the kind of person I was. He wasn't offering pity, but something else, something that made my skin crawl. He laid out his proposal. Her bills paid, the best hospice care available, and enough money left over for me to stop destroying myself. All he asked for in return was dinner with him, the next night, right here. Before that insane offer, he had simply asked, "How much do you owe?" The question had knocked the wind out of me. When I tried to deflect, telling him it was none of his business, he just stared back. $347,000, he stated, not asked. "Your mother." My shock must have been written all over my face. "I make it my business to know things," he explained, leaning back in his chair. It was then he passed a phone to one of his men, a silent order given and understood. He told me I looked like a person who was drowning, and in that moment, sitting beside him in that chair still warm from a previous occupant, I knew he was right. I only sat because he commanded it. "Sit down," he'd said, the quiet order carrying the force of a physical blow. When I stammered that I was working, he simply repeated himself and pulled out the chair next to him. Not across from him, but beside him. I knew our floor manager, Marco, was watching through the glass, and that a man like this never, ever gets told no. My legs gave out before my mind could argue, and I placed the water pitcher on the table with a shaking hand. Up close, he was even more intimidating. A pale scar cut through one eyebrow. His powerful hands, scarred across the knuckles, rested on the table, a heavy signet ring on his finger. The ice that shot through my veins started when he noticed the smallest detail. "You've been on your feet too long," he observed, his voice a mix of gravel and silk. "You're favoring your left ankle." I had twisted it hours earlier on a carelessly placed chair and had been painstakingly careful not to limp. His insight was terrifying. I tried to brush it off, to stay professional, but his gaze was relentless. It was then he asked my name. "Lily," I'd said, my own name feeling foreign on my tongue. He repeated it slowly, as if tasting the word, those storm cloud eyes of his reading my face like a language only he could understand, before he gave the order to sit. Yet it all started as just another order at another table. When I pushed through the frosted glass door into the VIP section, the air grew colder. 4 men were seated at table 12. 3 were clearly bodyguards, their dark, expensive suits and constantly scanning eyes a dead giveaway. But it was the 4th man, the one with silver hair and eyes like smoke and steel, who commanded the room. He sat facing the entrance, and his predatory gaze tracked my every step. The scent that came off him was cedar, gunpowder, and something primal that made the hairs on my arms stand up. He silenced the other men with a barely perceptible lift of his hand. I had approached the table with my customer service voice, a steady tone I'd perfected to mask my exhaustion. "Good evening, gentlemen," I'd said. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" The 3 guards gave their orders: scotch, bourbon, sparkling water, without even looking at me. But he remained silent, just watching. It was only when I forced myself to meet his gaze and ask for his order that he finally spoke, his accented voice smooth and deep. His first words weren't an order for a drink. They were a question. "What's your name?" And just before that, I had been standing by the kitchen doors, my feet screaming in cheap flats and my arms aching after 6 hours of carrying trays. I was just another invisible server, surrounded by expensive cologne and quiet money. Marcus, another waiter, hissed at me as he passed with a load of plates. "Table 7 needs water, and 12 just sat down. VIP section." I'd nodded, grabbing a pitcher, catching a glimpse of my reflection. At 26, I looked 40, weighed down by 3 jobs and a mountain of my mother's medical bills. As I headed toward the back corner of the restaurant, my hands were already starting to tremble, just thinking about entering that exclusive space where a bottle of wine cost more than my rent. Ah, so that's how it was. The knock on the door came just after 3 a.m. 2 men stood there, strangers in dark suits with faces carved from stone. One was younger, maybe 30, with a scar that traced a line from his ear to his jaw. The other, older and built like a fortress, had surprisingly kind eyes. The older one spoke. "Miss Lily, we have to go now." My mind reeled, but I grabbed my phone, slid my feet into sneakers, and followed them out of my apartment, still in an old t-shirt and flannel pajama pants. We moved through the silent building, down the stairs, and out a rear exit I never knew was there. A different car was waiting. A calm voice had come through my phone just 3 minutes earlier, belonging to a man I'd known for less than a month. A criminal who'd bought his way into my world with blood money and dangerous promises, yet looked at me like I was something to be treasured. "Go now," he'd commanded gently. "I'll find you when it's safe." And when he asked if I understood, if I trusted him, I had whispered a single word back into the darkness. "Yes." His voice had been just as low and rough in the car, the first time we'd really spoken. He told me he was 62 years old, the architect of an empire built on fear and brutality. He admitted to doing things that would make me sick, things he couldn't and wouldn't take back. I should have screamed, should have demanded he stop the car and let me out, away from the undertow of danger that surrounded him. But instead of running, I found myself asking a simple, terrifying question. Why me? The car that picked me up that night was a Mercedes, a sleek black shark idling in front of my rundown building. The interior smelled of leather and cedar, a scent I was beginning to associate with him. He was waiting in the back, a silhouette in a charcoal suit. "You came," he'd said, a hint of surprise in his voice. I clutched my borrowed purse, my knuckles white. "You paid my mother's bills." He'd simply nodded. "I keep my word." As the car glided through the city toward a private dinner, away from the prying eyes of a place like Giovanni's, I realized I didn't know this man's name beyond the one on a business card. And when I said it out loud, he just said, "Good." It meant I didn't read the crime reports. A few hours before that car arrived, a stranger stared back at me from my cracked apartment mirror. I wore a midnight blue dress borrowed from my friend Rachel, a dress that made me feel both exposed and powerful. My hair, uncharacteristically, was down, and the only jewelry I wore was a pair of small silver earrings my mother had given me for my 21st birthday. The reflection was a carefully constructed illusion, a woman who looked like she could sit across from a man like Salvatore Constantino and not fall apart. The buzz of my phone, a text from an unknown number, shattered the quiet. "A car is waiting downstairs." That morning, I'd made a call to a hospice facility, the one with gardens and private rooms I never thought we could afford. With my voice breaking, I arranged for my mother's intake. By noon, she was settled in a room that smelled of lavender, not despair. Tears of relief, the first I'd seen from her that weren't from pain, streamed down her face. "How did you afford this, baby?" she'd whispered, her frail hand clutching mine. "Don't worry about it, Mama," I'd lied, kissing her forehead. But I saw in her eyes that she knew. She knew something had changed in her daughter. The night before, I hadn't slept. How could I, with $347,000 sitting in my bank account? I checked 17 times before dawn, certain it was a hallucination. But it was real. Every dollar. The number pulsed on the screen, terrifying and impossible. The money had come from a man with silver hair and storm cloud eyes, a man with a scar cutting through his eyebrow like a warning sign, a man named Salvatore Constantino. I clutched my purse, my knuckles turning white. "Most people would have taken the money and disappeared," he observed, his voice calm as the car moved through the night. "Run, change their number, moved." My own voice was barely a whisper. "I'm not most people." A faint smile touched his lips. "No, you're not." Fear, sharp and sudden, pierced through my chest as we turned away from the familiar city streets. "I thought we were having dinner," I said. He must have seen the panic on my face. "We are," he assured me gently. "I'm not going to hurt you, Lily. You have my word." I should have asked who he was. Not just a businessman, that much was clear. The way the manager at Giovanni's trembled, the security detail, knowing my mother's medical bills down to the last dollar. But he spoke before I could. "I'm a businessman who operates in spaces where the law becomes flexible." A criminal? He didn't deny it. And I, in turn, didn't run. The car pulled up to a mansion behind imposing iron gates. The fire crackled softly in the massive stone hearth, its light dancing across his face. In his arms, I was finally safe. The storm outside now just a distant rumble. It was over. The threat was gone. He had made sure of it. This house, which had once felt like a beautiful cage, now felt like the only sanctuary in the world. He turned to me, his gaze intense, and brushed a stray piece of hair from my cheek. His touch was gentle, a stark contrast to the violence he had just unleashed to protect me. I leaned into his hand, my breath steady for the first time in days. We were here, together, in the quiet aftermath. He held me as if I were the most precious thing in his world. A man seeing not a pawn or a prize, but simply the woman he refused to lose. And in the silence, I understood what it was worth to be seen. The car had sped through the night, ending its journey here, beneath a grand portico where a man with silver-streaked hair had opened my door. Salvatore had taken my hand then, his grip firm and reassuring, leading me from the chaos into this breathtaking calm. I hadn't hesitated, my hand fitting into his, as if it had always belonged there. The realization no longer terrified me. It felt like a truth I had been waiting to accept. Now, standing inside this jewel box of a home, surrounded by marble floors and priceless art, the memory of that fear was already starting to fade. We had walked past crystal chandeliers and a grand, curving staircase, seeking not the opulence, but the quiet refuge he had built for us in the heart of the storm. But this peace had been paid for with pure terror. It began with a phone call at 2 in the morning, a shrill ring that sliced through my anxious dreams. I had answered, my voice thick with sleep, to an unknown number. Lily? Sal's voice was sharp, laced with an urgency that sent a jolt of ice through my veins. Listen to me very carefully. My men are coming for you. In exactly 3 minutes, they will be at your door. You go with them. No questions, no packing. Just go. The line was crackling with movement, with other voices in the background, a world of violence erupting somewhere far away, its shockwaves racing toward me. What is happening? I'd asked, already knowing the answer. Someone found out about you, he said, the words tight and controlled. They want to hurt me, so they will try to hurt you. There was a pause, a breath, and then the question that sealed my fate. The men will take you somewhere safe. Don't fight them. Don't run. Just trust me, Sal. Do you trust me, Lily? And I did. It was a terrifying, absolute trust, born from the vulnerability he had shown me. A trust rooted in a dinner where he had spoken of a wife lost to cancer 23 years ago, how all the money in the world couldn't save her. My hand had reached for his then, and I saw in his eyes a man who had forgotten what comfort felt like. That trust was the reason I didn't fight when his men arrived. It was why I walked away from everything I knew, stepping into the darkness with them. All because of the connection forged between us. It had deepened at a black tie gallery opening, the second week we knew each other. Standing beside him, I was a target for whispers and calculating glances from women dripping in diamonds. But Sal's hand never left the small of my back, a warm, possessive anchor. You're trying to scare me away, I had challenged him amidst the crowd. Yes, he admitted, a rare, genuine smile gracing his lips. It's not working. I know, he'd said, his voice low and devastating. That's what terrifies me. That night, he laid his truth bare. I look at you and see everything I thought I'd buried, he'd murmured, his gaze more captivating than any painting. Hope, softness, the possibility of something beyond blood and business. He had been preparing me, and himself, for this. The first week, he'd sent white roses not to me, but to my mother at the hospice. So she knows her daughter is cherished, the card read. My mother, her fingers trembling, had looked at me with knowing eyes. He must be very special, she whispered. He's dangerous, Mama. All the best ones are, baby, she'd replied. He was drawing me into his orbit, an inescapable gravity pulling me closer one deliberate step at a time. This entire fever dream had unraveled over 3 short weeks. He never pushed, never demanded, just appeared in my life like something inevitable. It had all started on a night that felt like a fairy tale, the kind where the beautiful castle belongs to a beast. He had taken me to dinner, to a table set for 2 overlooking a softly lit garden. We talked for hours, and I found myself telling him things I'd never told anyone, about my mother, my fears, my exhaustion. He listened as if every word mattered, as if I mattered. And then he warned me. Men like me don't get happy endings, Lily. We get blood and betrayal. But I didn't pull away. I had asked him then what he truly wanted from me. His hand had closed over mine, his fingers tangling with mine as if he were drowning and I was his only lifeline. Everything, he'd said simply. I want to keep you safe and see you smile without exhaustion behind your eyes. He'd stopped, his jaw tight. I want to be someone different than who I am, someone who deserves you. The raw vulnerability in his voice had shattered something inside me. making me feel not fear, but a dangerous, intoxicating connection. He told me I should run, that I should forget him, but he knew I wouldn't. You felt it too, didn't you? He'd asked, his smile sharp enough to cut. That moment, the world shifted. He was right. From the moment he found me, the world had been in black and white, and he was the only color left. I'd walked into his castle with my eyes wide open, knowing this story could end in ruins or salvation, and I found I didn't care which. The beast had shown me his hunger and his vulnerability, and I had stayed. And it was all because of how this began, the real reason he had sought me out. It wasn't about my mother's bills or my quiet life. It was about something much simpler, something he confessed to me on the very first night, as his car pulled through the gates of this very estate. He turned to face me fully then, and the raw intensity in his eyes stole my breath. "Everyone," he'd said, his voice low. "My associates, my enemies, my own family. They say I'm too old, too cold, that I traded my humanity for power decades ago." His hand lifted, and his fingers gently brushed a strand of hair from my face. The touch was reverent, completely at odds with the monster the world saw. "And then you looked at me like I was just a man, tired, human, not a myth or a means to an end, a man." His hand dropped away, but the ghost of his touch remained. "Do you understand what that's worth? To be seen as human by someone who has no reason to pretend." "You'll come anyway." The phone had slipped from my fingers then, clattering to the floor. My friend Marco had rushed to my side, his face pale with concern, asking if I was all right, if Mr. Constantino had hurt me. "No," I'd managed to say, the word feeling foreign. He hadn't hurt me. But as I picked up my phone, my hands shaking, I saw my reflection in the dark screen. My eyes were wide, my face flushed. I looked like someone who had just stepped off a cliff. And a voice in my head whispered that I'd been falling for a long, long time. And I'd only just noticed when Salvatore Constantino appeared, to either catch me or drag me down into the darkness with him. He came back to me, just as he promised. The war he'd started on his own terms was over, the lesson taught in blood echoing through every criminal network in the city. The man who had threatened me, Dmitry Volkov, was now just a ghost, a cautionary tale. I was finally safe, not just hidden, but protected by a fearsome reputation Salvatore had built with his own hands. He had promised to bury anyone who stood in his way, and now, standing before me, whole and victorious, he had kept his word. But that safety was born from 3 days of chilling uncertainty. I had been left alone with the terrible, exhilarating knowledge that I'd chosen the beast, and I would have to live with the blood spilled in my name. I should have been horrified, knowing he was out there painting the streets red to keep me safe. Instead, I found myself clinging to the memory of his last kiss, tasting the lethal promise on his lips as I whispered for him to come back to me. His vow was simple and cold. Him and anyone else who thought they could use me against him would be eliminated. That brutal bargain was sealed with a kiss that was anything but gentle. It wasn't a sweet caress, but a devouring, a raw and desperate collision of two worlds. It was the explosive release of weeks of pent-up restraint, a hunger so intense it felt like it could consume us both. His mouth claimed mine like a drowning man finding air, his hands pulling me tight against him until no space remained between us. This was fire and possession, a claiming I met with equal desperation. And yet, even in that moment of surrender, he had offered me an escape. "Tell me to stop, Lily," he'd said, his voice rough with emotion. "Tell me you want nothing to do with me, and I'll walk away." It was my one chance, the cliff's edge where I could still step back to safety. My heart hammered in my chest, knowing this was the moment of choice. If I didn't want him to stop, he growled, then God help us both. He had to explain why it had come to that. He told me about a rival, a Russian named Dmitry Volkov. They were caught in the usual dance for power, territory, and business. "And he found out about you," S had said. his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He'd seen us together and had me followed, learning my routines. He sent me a message, S continued, his voice tight. Said he'd take from me what I clearly valued. Said you'd pay for my ambitions. A cold dread had washed over me as I finally understood. That chilling explanation only came after he finally appeared at the safe house. I'd heard the caravan of cars on the gravel, then saw him striding toward the door, his silver hair catching the sun, his face a mask of controlled fury. But when he stepped inside, my fear gave way to anger. Am I okay? I shot back, crossing my arms. I've been locked in a gilded cage for 3 days with armed men watching me. So you tell me, S, am I okay? A flicker of pain crossed his face before he said, Don't be afraid of me, be angry, hate me, but don't fear me. For 3 days, that gilded cage had been my world. I'd explored the stunning modern house like a prisoner pacing her cell. It was beautiful and comfortable, but utterly confining. Someone had provided for my every need, clothes in my size, the kind of food I liked, toiletries, everything except answers, everything except freedom. The security team changed shifts like clockwork, their silence as absolute as the walls around me. The only communication I received in those first long hours was a text from S. I'm sorry, I'll explain everything. You're safe there. My best men are with you. I wanted to throw the phone, to scream for answers. Instead, my fingers typed a simple truth. I'm scared. The reply was immediate. I know, so am I, but I won't let anyone hurt you. I'd burn the world down first. And somehow, impossibly, I found myself believing him. Believing him was the only thing I could do, because it all began in silence and confusion. It started in a black SUV, one with bulletproof glass so thick I could see the distinct layers in the faint light. We drove for hours, leaving the city, the suburbs, and any familiar landmarks far behind. A young man with military precision was at the wheel. An older man sat in the back with me, his hand resting casually over the gun I could see outlined beneath his jacket. As dawn broke, we arrived at a fortress of glass and steel, where the older man finally spoke. You'll stay here. With my hand in his, I knelt beside Salvatore. My mother, looking more at peace than I had seen her in months, took both our hands and placed mine gently into his. Her voice was thin, but her words were solid. I don't have much time left, she said, her eyes moving between us. Maybe weeks, maybe days, but I need to know you'll be safe. She looked directly at Salvatore, the man the news called a monster. I may be dying, but I still read. I know who you are. Salvatore didn't flinch. Then you know what I am. I know what you do, she corrected, her frail hand reaching up to touch his face. But I also know what you've done for my daughter. The way you look at her, like she hung the moon. She did, Salvatore replied, his voice low and simple. My mother's eyes welled with tears. You love her, she whispered. More than my own life, he confirmed. And you'll protect her? Even from yourself, if you have to? Always, he promised without a flicker of hesitation. She gave a slow, final nod, her gaze settling on me. Come here, baby. The scene was surreal. The sprawling hospice gardens outside, the scent of roses drifting through the window, and my dying mother giving her blessing to the most dangerous man on the East Coast. So you're the one, she had said the moment we walked in, her eyes immediately finding our joined hands. Salvatore had shocked me by kneeling beside her wheelchair, meeting her at eye level. Mrs. Morrison, he'd said respectfully, I'm Salvatore Constantino. That quiet moment of peace had been earned just hours before. On the drive back to the city, the security detail had doubled, 2 cars in front, 2 behind, all filled with men whose sole job was now my protection. His hand never left mine. As we neared the city limits, I'd said, I need to see my mother. Of course, he'd answered, lifting my hand to his lips. We'll go now, and Lily, she's been moved to the best hospice facility on the coast. Better doctors, better care. She'll be comfortable. Tears had sprung to my eyes. You didn't have to. Yes, I did, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She's your mother. That makes her family. And I protect what's mine. And I was his. I'd made that choice in the hazy dawn light, lying tangled with him in the sheets of the safe house bed. What happens now? I had asked. Now, he'd murmured, kissing my hair. I take you home. Our home. And I spend the rest of my life making sure nothing ever touches you. It sounded like another cage. He must have felt me tense. Perhaps, he'd admitted, his arms tightening. But this time, you'll have the key. You can leave any time. I won't stop you. I studied the face of this beautiful, terrible man. The life, the violence, the loss carved into him. I choose to stay, I'd whispered. The relief that washed over his face was staggering. That choice was sealed by a night of fire and confession. After he had carried me to the bedroom, he had laid me on the bed and hesitated, his control stretched thin. Tell me to stop, he'd rasped against my mouth. Don't stop, I'd breathed, my hands already on the buttons of his ruined shirt. Don't you dare stop. He'd touched me like I was something precious, memorizing every sound I made as he unraveled me completely. It was a claiming, a joining of two broken souls. Before the passion, there were words that hit me with the force of a physical blow. I love you, Lily, he'd said, his voice rough with an emotion he'd likely never shown another soul. I'm too old for you, too damaged, too steeped in blood, but I love you with everything I have left. His return was the reason for it all. He had appeared in the doorway of the living room, a warrior back from battle. His shirt was torn, spattered with blood that wasn't his. A fresh bruise darkened his cheekbone, his knuckles were split and raw, but his eyes found mine, and the relief in them was a mirror of my own. Lily, was all he said, but it was enough. I threw myself into his arms, and he crushed me to his chest, burying his face in my hair. He smelled of smoke and metal. It's done, he rumbled against my ear, his voice a low growl of finality. Dmitry Volkov is dead. His organization is scattered. Anyone who even looked at you wrong is either buried or running for their life. The violence of it should have terrified me. Instead, a wave of heat washed through me. For 3 days, I hadn't known if he would ever come back. 72 hours. That's how long he was gone. 72 hours of me pacing the safe house like a caged animal, my mind a storm of worst-case scenarios. I watched the news, trying to piece together the truth from sterile reports. A warehouse fire in the industrial district. 3 bodies pulled from the river. A Russian-owned restaurant, suddenly shuttered, its interior gutted. I tried not to imagine him lying somewhere, bleeding out. I tried not to think about his promise to return, and how desperately I needed him to keep it. The guards said nothing, but I saw it in their eyes. A mixture of respect and a darker thing, maybe fear, or just awe at what their boss became when pushed. Then, on the 3rd night, around 3 in the morning, the silence of the forest was shattered by the sound of engines. Headlights sliced through the darkness as multiple vehicles approached at high speed. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pressed my palm to the cold window. I heard the front door open, followed by sharp, urgent voices. Footsteps, heavy and fast, echoed through the house. And then, he was there, standing in the doorway, and for the first time in 3 days, I could finally breathe. He was alive. He had come back for me. Why? Why would a man like him unleash hell for me? It all came back to a quiet desperation no one else saw. For 3 years, since my mother got sick, I had felt like a ghost, a burden, a servant, a daughter forced to watch the person she loved most fade away in a place we could barely afford. I was just a girl, lost and invisible to the world. But he saw me. Salvatore Constantino, the most dangerous man I had ever met, saw me. When he looked at me, I wasn't a servant or a problem to be managed. I was just seen, really seen. And because he saw me, he acted. He started paying the bills for my mother's care, secretly lifting a financial weight that was crushing me. It was an act of kindness from a man who dealt in cruelty, an obsession taking root in a life built on darkness. That act, that quiet help, was what made me a target for his enemies. That was his weakness, his reason to make the world burn. It all started not with a threat or a bang, but with a whisper of compassion in a dark world, a man looking at a broken girl and seeing something worth protecting. That was how it all began. With the sapphire on my finger catching the moonlight, I realized their entire world was built on a single promise. They said S was too old for love, but in my arms, deliriously happy, he whispered, "You proved them all wrong, Amor. You proved them all wrong." He kissed me then, a deep, slow promise of a future I once never thought possible. We were tangled together, a testament to a love that defied all logic. "You're not a monster," I had told him 100 times before, the same truth echoing in the quiet of our room. "You're just a man who loves me." He smiled against my lips. "And I'm just a woman crazy enough to love you back." We were definitely crazy, but we were happy. He slid the ring on my finger with trembling hands, pulling me to the floor with him as if I were the only thing anchoring him to this world. "I love you," he had choked out. "My brave, beautiful girl who dared to love a monster." It was a yes that came out as a strangled whisper. Of course, yes. That single word was the culmination of everything. He had opened a small velvet box to reveal a sapphire the color of midnight, circled by diamonds. "So, I'm asking you to choose me one last time," he'd said. "Marry me. Build this life with me. Let me spend whatever years I have left proving that love doesn't have a shelf life." I saw tears in his eyes as he spoke. They said I was too old for this, too set in my ways. But you, Lily, you loved me anyway. You saw past the age, the violence, the darkness, and you chose me. Every single day, you choose me. It started when he led me to our bedroom, not for passion, but for something more profound. He knelt before me, his storm cloud eyes deadly serious, and my heart began to thunder in my chest. "What are you doing?" I had asked, completely unprepared for the turn our night was about to take. But this happiness was only possible because we had found our truth first. I held him tightly, whispering, "That man, the one who feels and loves and hopes, that's who I fell in love with. Not the boss, not the legend, just you." He had pulled back then, his eyes red but clear, and kissed me with a tenderness that made my soul ache. "Go to nursing school," he'd said. "Chase your dreams, but promise you'll always let me keep you safe." His shoulders had been shaking, and it took me a moment to realize he was weeping silent tears into my shirt. "I never thought I'd have this again," he whispered against my skin. "After Maria died, I locked it all away. I told myself I was better off cold, alone. And then you looked at me like I was just a man, and everything I'd buried came roaring back." He had pulled me tight against him, his face buried in my neck. That breakthrough came after I laid it all bare for him. "It is simple," I told him, looking him straight in the eye. "I love you. You love me. Everything else is just noise." He had made it seem so complicated, but I saw the desperate hope in his eyes as he searched mine. "You know about the scholarships?" he'd asked, his hands gripping my hips. "I know everything, S. I pay attention. I see you." I cupped his face, the stubble scratching my palms. "Yes, you're older. Yes, our life is dangerous and complicated. But I don't want normal. I want you. I want the man who was supposedly too old for love, but loves me so fiercely it terrifies us both. I saw the real him, the man who reads poetry when he thinks I'm asleep and who anonymously funds 3 scholarships because he believes in second chances, even if he feels he doesn't deserve one himself. He finally showed me his fear because I had forced him to. I moved to straddle his lap, making him meet my gaze. Listen to me, Salvatore Constantino, I'd commanded gently. I'm not going anywhere. I see exactly what you are, the violence, the danger, the darkness, but I also see the man who held me while I wept for my mother. He couldn't hide the vulnerability in his voice when he asked, "You're waiting for me to realize what you are and run, aren't you?" The words broke my heart. I'm 62 years old, Lily. You're 26. One day you'll wake up and see the monster, the age, the blood on my hands, and you'll leave. And I'll have to let you go because I promised I would. The muscle in his jaw had ticked. I know, he'd said, though I could tell he didn't truly believe it. His fear was sparked by my own need for a life beyond his protection. So I should just stay locked in this beautiful prison forever? I asked, my voice gentle but firm. S, I love this life, but I can't just be your possession hidden away. I have to be my own person. His worry was palpable. There are still people who'd use you to hurt me, Lily, he'd said, his voice tight. Not as many as before, but they're out there. I saw the tension in his shoulders when I told him. He tried to control his voice, to make it sound even. That's wonderful. You'll be brilliant at it. But I knew him too well. You're worried, I stated. He didn't deny it. I'm always worried. It had been a peaceful evening. We were talking about my future, about me wanting to do something that honored my mother's memory. I told him the community college had accepted me into their nursing program. We had found a quiet rhythm in the months before that conversation. Evenings in the garden became our ritual, a space away from the brutal empire he ran. Here, we were just two people who found each other against all odds. He would join me on the stone bench, his arm around my shoulders, and we'd watch the sunset. That day, I admitted I was thinking about my mom. She would have loved this garden, I said. He replied softly, she loved you more. Everything else was just a detail. I had poured my energy into the garden of our new home, not the safe house, but the main residence he had lived in alone for 23 years. I planted white roses, my mother's favorite, and lavender and jasmine, filling the air with the scent of better times. It was a project to occupy my hands and quiet my mind. That peace was hard-won, built on a foundation of shared sorrow. S had turned me to face him, his eyes burning. You did what no one else dared, Lily. You made a monster remember how to be human. But I saw the truth. You were always human, S, I'd said, touching his beautiful, terrible face. You just needed someone to remind you. He framed my face with his hands. And now that I remember what it's like to love and be loved, I'll never forget again. People would always talk about the age difference, about what he was, about how a girl like me ended up with a man like him. Let them talk, he'd said, his lips brushing my temple. They said I was too old for love, too cold, too dangerous. But you proved them all wrong just by being brave enough to see me. I agreed to the security, the precautions, all of it. 2 guards, I argued, not 10. And they had to wait outside my classes. 4 guards, 2 in, 2 out, 3. That was his final offer. A faint smile touched his lips. You're a tough negotiator. I gave him another softer kiss. We can make this work, S. The years between us, the danger, the whole tangled mess. We'll untangle it together. Together, he echoed, as if the word were foreign. I haven't known together in 23 years. Well, you do now, so you'd better get used to it. The next 4 months flew by in a haze of new schedules and surprising happiness. I dove into my classes, anatomy, pharmacology, patient care, with a passion I hadn't felt since my mother fell ill. S had every right to be worried. There were incidents. A car following too close, a man asking too many questions, a threat spray-painted on my car. But Sal's security team handled everything with swift, silent efficiency. And, with each incident, S would hold me tight, his hands trembling with a fear he refused to speak aloud. I can't lose you, he'd murmur in the dark. I only survived losing Maria because I had nothing left. But you're my everything. If I lost you, there wouldn't be anything left to put back together. Then it's a good thing I'm cautious, I would reply, not to mention well protected and too stubborn to die. The real trial, however, arrived on an October Tuesday. I was leaving the campus, backpack laden with books, my thoughts on an upcoming exam. The security detail, 3 men, our compromise, kept a respectful distance. A black sedan, unlike any of S's cars, pulled up beside me. It just felt wrong, deep in my bones. The window slid down, revealing a man I'd never seen. He looked about 30, with chilling eyes and a smile that made my skin crawl. "Lily Morrison," he said. "Or is it Lily Constantino now? I hear that's what the old man calls you." My guards immediately shifted, forming a wall between me and the car. The man simply chuckled. "Easy, boys. I'm not here to harm her, just to pass along a message." He held up a phone, showing me a photo of S leaving a downtown restaurant. "Tell your boss the Italians are unhappy about the Volkov deal. That he made some powerful enemies when he took care of Dmitri. Now there's a price on both of your heads." Ice shot through my veins, but my voice came out steady. "Tell them to come and get it. See how that works out for them." "Oh, we will." His smile grew wider. "But we wanted you to know first. We want you to live with it. We want the old man to watch you glance over your shoulder, wondering when the bullet will finally come. That's a better punishment than death, the waiting." The window went up and the car sped off. My lead guard, Marco, a former Navy SEAL with S for 15 years, was already on his phone. "Boss, we've got a problem." S was on campus in less than 10 minutes, his convoy of SUVs screaming to a stop by the library. He was out of his vehicle before it even stopped rolling, his eyes frantic, his tanned face pale. "Are you all right?" His hands roamed over my arms and shoulders, checking for injuries as he breathed heavily. "I'm okay, S. I'm okay. Just shaken up." "Who was it? What did they say?" His voice was now dangerously cold, a tone I rarely heard. Marco gave him the report, and S's jaw tightened with every word. When he finished, S yanked me into an embrace so tight it was almost painful. "You're done with school," he said into my hair. "It's too dangerous. I'll get private tutors. You can finish your degree at the house, but you're not setting foot here again where I can't keep you safe." "No." I pushed away just enough to meet his gaze. "No, S. That's exactly what they're counting on. They want me to be afraid, to hide away. I refuse to give them that." "Lily, I'm serious." I clutched his shirt, willing him to understand the resolve in my eyes. "Add more security. Sweep the campus for threats every day. Do whatever you have to do to make yourself feel better. But I am not dropping out of school. I will not let them win." "You're asking me to let you walk into a line of fire every single day," his voice broke. "To send you out there, knowing men want to hurt you because of me, knowing that loving me put a target on your back." "Yes." I cupped his face, feeling the tremors beneath my hands. "I'm asking you to trust me, to trust your men, to trust that our bond is stronger than their hate. I can't lose you." The words were broken, raw. "Lily, I can't." "You won't." I kissed him, channeling all my conviction into that one act. "But you have to let me live my life, S. Truly live. Not just exist in a gilded prison. That's what love is. It isn't about possession or protection above all else. It's trusting the one you love to choose for themselves, even when it's terrifying." He remained silent for a long time, his forehead resting against mine, his breathing labored. When he finally spoke, his voice was a near whisper. "You have more courage than I ever will." "No, I just have something worth being courageous for." That evening, S convened a meeting. Not at our home, but at a high-end restaurant he owned downtown, one of his legitimate enterprises. I was seated next to him at the head of a long table, surrounded by men who looked like they belonged in a gangster movie. They were his captains, his lieutenants, the entire framework of his empire. "This is Lily," S announced, his hand resting firmly on my shoulder. "Some of you have met her. All of you know who she is to me." The men acknowledged me with nods, their expressions a mix of respect and curiosity. "The Italians have threatened her, and by extension, they have threatened us." S's voice was even, but the rage simmering beneath was unmistakable. "They believe they can frighten me by going after what I cherish. They think my age has made me soft, weak, too old to protect what belongs to me." He rose to his feet, and the room's temperature seemed to plummet 10 degrees. "They are mistaken." For the next hour, I saw S shift from the gentle man who comforted me into the formidable boss who built a dynasty on fear and respect. He outlined a plan with the precision of a general, naming key figures in the Italian syndicate, detailing how they would cripple their supply lines and choke their revenue streams, how they would make them bleed where it counted. "We are not starting this war," he concluded, "but we will end it, so completely, so brutally, that a decade from now, men will still tell stories about what happens when you threaten Salvatore Constantino's family." The men filed out with grim resolve, leaving just S and me in the room. "That was frightening," I confessed. "That was necessary." He drew me onto his lap, his arms a secure cage around me. "I will never apologize for who I am, Lily, or for the things I can do. Those men threatened you. They chose their own destiny." "I know, and I knew it then. I had accepted everything about him the moment I chose to love him. Just promise you'll come back to me when it's over. Whatever you must do, whoever you have to be to keep us safe, just always come back to me." He pressed kisses to my temple, my cheek, and finally my lips. "I swear it." The war raged for 3 weeks. I barely saw S in that time. He would be gone before sunrise and return long after midnight, the strain and violence of his days etched on his face. Yet he always found his way to our bed, always held me close, always promised that the end was near. Then, one evening, he was home early. I was in the garden, my sanctuary from the chaos, when I heard his steps on the terrace. I turned, and the expression on his face made me hold my breath. It was relief. Deep, overwhelming relief. "It's over," he said, his voice raw. "The threat is gone. The Italians have accepted the terms. You are safe." I flew into his arms and he lifted me from the ground, burying his face in my hair. "What did you do?" I asked, though a part of me dreaded the answer. "What was required?" He set me down, his hands cradling my face. "But it is finished now, truly finished. This city understands that you are not to be touched, that you are protected, that you are mine. And if anyone forgets, they will face a penalty that makes death seem like a kindness." I should have been afraid. I should have fled from this man and his stark brutality. Instead, I kissed him, tasting love and relief, and the dark promise that he would set the world on fire before letting anyone harm me. "Thank you," I whispered against his lips. "For what?" "For proving them wrong. For showing them you aren't too old for love, not too jaded, not too lost. You're just a man who loves with everything he has and protects what's his." "What's ours?" he corrected me gently. "This life, this love, this future we are forging against all odds that should have torn us apart." "Ours," I affirmed. A year later, I was standing in a hospital room in my scrubs, having just survived my first shift as a licensed practical nurse. My feet were throbbing, my back was aching, and I smelled of antiseptic and effort. I had never felt more fulfilled. S was waiting for me outside, looking completely out of his element as he leaned against his car amidst the departing hospital staff. But his face broke into that rare, genuine smile he reserved just for me. "How did it go?" he asked as I walked into his arms. "Exhausting, terrifying, and absolutely perfect." I leaned into his embrace, his arms solid and reassuring around me. I helped save a life today, Sal. I actually helped. I'm so proud of you, he kissed the top of my head. More than you will ever comprehend. We drove home through the city he commanded, a city I was learning to call my own. The security detail kept their distance, a constant watchful presence, but no longer the oppressive force they once were. We had found our equilibrium. He earned the right to say that by being my anchor in the darkest storm. When I finally surfaced from the fog of loss 3 weeks after we buried my mother, I found him waiting, not pushing, just there. What now? I asked him one morning, watching the sunrise over a city he ruled from the shadows. He wrapped his arms around me from behind. Now you heal, he said, his chin on my shoulder. Now you live. Now you let me love you the way you deserve, fiercely, completely, without reservation. He held me through the funeral arrangements and the service. He held me as they lowered her into the earth, and I felt like a part of me was going with her. He simply held me through the grief without trying to fix it, a steady, solid presence. And it all began with the promise made in a room that smelled of flowers and loss. My mother passed in her sleep 3 days later, peacefully, knowing her daughter was cared for. I broke down then, sobbing into S's shoulder as he held me and my mother stroked my hair, the three of us bound by love and a strange, impossible path. Her smile was the first truly happy one I'd seen since her diagnosis. Then I can go in peace, she whispered. His voice was rough with emotion. I promise. On my life, on my honor, on everything I am. She turned to S. Promise me you'll take care of her when I'm gone. That you'll love her even when she's difficult, grieving, when she pushes you away. My mother squeezed our hands. I see how you look at him, Lily, like he's your anchor, and I see how he looks at you, like you're his redemption. They said he was too old for love, and we proved them spectacularly, wonderfully wrong. Here in his arms, our future feels limitless, a life built in defiance of every rule. But this happiness was earned. It began when I ignored all the warnings that he was too cold, too dangerous, a man beyond saving. I chose to do what no one else dared, to look past the reputation and see a man starved for affection, one who had waited 23 years for someone with the courage to truly see him. That one decision, that single terrifying step, led me straight into his arms. And in return for my faith, he gave me everything. A world of safety, a love so fierce it still takes my breath away. It's a love that redeems, the kind that reminds a monster of his humanity and doesn't care about society's approval. It just is, burning brightly against the dark. We were the most unlikely match, the aging crime boss and the young nurse, the darkness and the light. And to think this impossible, beautiful life we built from the wreckage of our pasts all started with a single glance across a crowded room on that first night at Giovanni's. Ah, so that's how it all began. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.